Hey everybody, welcome to this month's Don't Get Rusty. And as you can see on the screen, we are talking about Get to the Choppa, fun with learning to fly helicopters. And we have a special guest, as you can see on the screen here, that we'll introduce shortly, but we're very excited and hope you guys enjoy this episode. So really glad you're here with us. Now, let me click the appropriate spot. There it goes. As always, we're going to just do a little bit of housekeeping and talk about the controls just in case you're new here. So if you are on a computer, you will see an attendee control panel that looks something like this. And the key part here that you want to pay attention to is that little bubble that has got a question mark in it. And to click on that, and then down below, you'll see a place to type in your question. Very important, you must click that send button or otherwise we won't see it, and we will do our best to respond. As you all know, we do get an awful lot of folks on these webinars, and so we won't be able to answer everybody's question, but we'll do the best that we can. The other part is if you are on a tablet, you will see a menu that looks more like this. So up on that upper right-hand corner, you should see something like a question mark. And then if you tap on that, again, a box will pop up, type in your question and make sure you hit that send key. And the key part here is that do know that when we see those, it actually timestamps them for us and everything. So we will see those responses when they come in the appropriate order. And I think that is that for that part. My name, as always, is Chris Moser. I'm the Senior Director of Flight Training Education here at AOPA, and glad to be with you. I am a CFI, and I also work here to support flight instructors and flight schools. And I'm very glad to introduce someone who used to be here with us at AOPA, Michael Hangartner here with us. He's our helicopter guru. So Michael, introduce yourself, please.
Thanks, Chris. It is really exciting to be here, first of all. Thanks for having me on. As you know, I always enjoy talking helicopters to anyone nearby who will listen, so it's fun being able to do it here. I am a recently arrived Florida man, as you can see. I'm also an airplane CFI and a commercial helicopter and drone pilot. I currently work at Rexair Professional Pilot Academy. So that is a new pilot academy that's open in Sebring, Florida. And it is a fast track academy where students will go get a full-time accelerated fast track to becoming a professional pilot. One thing that does differentiate us in our training at Rexair is that we offer what we call 360-degree flight training. So it's not just focused on the technical aspects of becoming a pilot, but also on the soft skills involved. Those things like professionalism and time management, networking, things that are going to set you up for success in any career, whether it's aviation or not. And then, as you said, I'm also a former AOPA employee. So I spent some time in You Can Fly, a few years there. I worked as a manager in the Flying Clubs initiative, and then I also worked on developing AOPA's high school curriculum.
Very cool. So we're really happy to have you here with us, Michael, as always. And obviously, this is why we knew him well, and that's why I knew he would be a great guest for this. So looking forward to what you have to tell us about helicopters today. All right, before we get to the content, actually, Michael, give you the honors.
Sure. Let's throw it over to Stephen. Say hello, Stephen.
Hello, Stephen. As you can see, I have my special hat for today's content. I got that just for you, Michael.
I appreciate that. That's great.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, coordinator of the Flight Training Initiative, I work with Chris and some other folks on a variety of projects, including being able to produce these lovely webinars. It's always a blast doing these. So, work in the background, keeping things functioning as best I can.
And you do a good job of it, Stephen, especially with our like corny stuff that we do at the beginning. All right. Hey, as you probably all know, Don't Get Rusty and all of our other You Can Fly programs are funded by the AOPA foundations and donations to that. So if you like this program and would like to support it, please consider donating to the foundation, and you can get to the information there at www.aopafoundation.org. All right, couple of things. Number one, if you are here with us in the live broadcast here on June 20th, 2024, when we're going live here, yes, you will get Wings credit. And in fact, that's only if you're live. If you're watching this later on YouTube or the recorded broadcast, unfortunately, Wings credit is not available then. And the cool thing is you don't have to do anything to get that Wings credit as long as you registered using your FAAsafety.gov email address. So as long as you use that, you're good to go. I know that Stephen, I believe we're going to put a link in the chat in case you're worried that maybe you didn't register with that FAAsafety.gov. He's going to have a link for you to let him know. We're doing something new this month to make it a little bit easier to coordinate those. And the second thing, the big question we often get asked is this being recorded? And in fact, it is being recorded. And so as you can see on the screen up here, it will show up in a few days. Please give us a few days to get that process. So just think early next week. It'll be on our AOPA pilot video YouTube channel under the playlist called Don't Get Rusty Webinars. It'll look like something like that. And then it'll also be on the web page. It'll be posted up there at webinars.aopa.org. And then there's a Don't Get Rusty category list there. Same video, just two different places to find it. Okay. Okay, so Stephen, want to tell us a little bit about what happened this day in aviation history?
Sure. So June 20th, 1938, flying I'm not sure, the Focke-Wulf. It's a German pilot, so Carl Bode. Set a helicopter record distance for going 143.09, very specific number of miles, around the base over Germany. And there's a photo of the very interesting aircraft he was flying at the time.
And that looks like
fun things to see.
What would you call it? It looks like it's like partial airplane, partial helicopter.
Yeah, it was like two rotors and like an airplane-looking fuselage to it. So it's
the propeller
very strange
too. Yeah, interesting. Yeah. Almost like maybe a gyrocopter-ish type of thing.
Gyroplane,
yeah, gyroplane. So
cool.
So set some records back in 1938, flying around the airspace over Berlin. It went on to be a pretty prolific helicopter pilot throughout the rest of his life.
Very cool. And I like the precision there, the 0.069 miles. I'm going to start measuring my stuff that way, I think.
Very specific. Well,
Germans tend to be precise. Yeah, exactly.
Right, just don't ask what he was doing for like the next 15 years after that, but then things were normal again.
Cool. All right. So what are we going to do today? Well, Michael is going to take us on a little journey here. He's going to talk about what it is to be training in a helicopter. He's going to talk a little bit about the stories that are involved there too, like some stories about some cool things that he's done in helicopters. And then he's going to try to talk a little bit about how helicopters work and fly. And I know, Michael, you're going to give us some caveats there. And then finally, airplanes versus helicopters. And then the most important question, why would you want to do this in the first place? So we'll get there in just a moment. But first, before we start, as last thing is our poll. So let's find out a little bit more about the audience that we've got here with us today. And so please, if you would roll the poll, Stephen, our choices are as follows. Have you ever flown in a helicopter? And so is it A, just one time? B, yeah, all the time. C, no, but I really want to. D, are you nuts? And E, is that where the propeller's on the roof? So what do you think, Michael? What do you think people might say on this one?
I don't know. I'm curious to see how much of the audience flies helicopters frequently.
Cool. I'm going to predict, I'm going to guess A, just once is what I'm thinking that people might say. So I'm going to go over here and just get an idea of what we're seeing. All right, we got about 45% of the people voting. We'll give them just a little bit longer to see if we can get to around 75, 80% before we close it and look at the results. And is that the proper terminology, Michael, for the propeller being on the roof?
It is not, no. That would be the rotor, but nice try there. I don't feel like those last two choices are relevant at all. I just sort of assume that everyone has either flown in a helicopter or wants to, but
yes,
we'll see.
That completely unbiased opinion.
Completely unbiased.
All right, we're at 80%. Let's go ahead and close that poll and see the results. And then, Michael, there is a little section on your side over there if you can't see the poll results, but as you can just hit the little drop down. Yeah. So as we can see, look at that. 47% of our audience is just once. 26% saying yes all the time. So they're the vast majority saying yes, they've been in helicopters at least one time, if not a lot. 22% no, but I want to. So there it goes to your thing. We've got a vast majority here that are interested, oddly enough. And then we got 3% with the no, are you nuts, and only 2% with the propeller on the roof. Was that you, Stephen, by any chance? Because I know you tend to click on the things that I think are dumb jokes.
I've got a propeller on my hat, so I'm good.
There it is. All right, let's get to it, you guys. So I'm really glad to see that so many folks are interested and or do it. And let's get to it. So Michael, please take us away.
Yeah, so I'm going to start out just by talking about my journey personally into helicopters, how I got started and what the training process was like for me. So I got started initially in October of 2015 when I took an intro flight. I've got to say, when I first became a pilot back in, I guess in 2010, I had really not given any thought to being a helicopter pilot at that point. I had always found helicopters really interesting, but when I started flight training in Illinois, I didn't actually know of any schools that did helicopter lessons, and it really just wasn't anything that was on my radar. But when I went to AOPA, as you know, in Frederick, there is a lot of helicopter activity at Frederick Airport. Half the times when you'd be looking out the windows at AOPA, it seemed like you would see a helicopter somewhere hovering or doing an auto rotation. And it just looked like a lot of fun. And I became curious and decided that I was just going to take an intro flight. Now, quick word of warning for anyone out there. Don't take an intro flight in a helicopter if you're not fully prepared to sink good amount of time and resources then into becoming a helicopter pilot, because it truly is like a drug. It will suck you in if you take even one flight in a helicopter. I know when I initially went up, like I said, I was planning on doing it once, largely so I had a story to tell. Could always talk about the day I'd flown a helicopter. But it ended up being so much more fun than even I had envisioned. And it honestly started before we even took off. So first thing we did, we lifted off into a hover, and we were making our way over to the area in Frederick Airport where helicopters take off from. So we were just going down the taxiway. And the instructor asked me if I would like to do a series of pirouettes. And I wasn't actually sure what a pirouette even was in a helicopter, but
Sounds like ballet.
got a helpful model here that I'm going to use for some illustrations. But a pirouette is actually when the helicopter continues on a forward track, but as it does so, it begins making a series of 360-degree turns as it maintains the center line of the taxiway. And doing that just kind of blew my mind. I mean, it really opened my eyes to the kinds of movement that helicopters are capable of. It made me realize that there are more things in heaven and earth than I had dreamt of in my philosophy as a fixed wing pilot up to that point. And so we continued from there. Takeoff was a lot of fun, and discovery flight starts a lot like a discovery flight in an airplane. So you take off, you do some straight and level flight, some turns, climbs and descents, all the basic maneuvers. And those didn't seem too difficult. But then the instructor asked if I wanted an auto rotation demonstrated. And of course, the only proper response to that is yes. I think a lot of people probably know.
Michael?
It is. I think a lot of people probably know what an auto rotation is, but for those that do not, it's a maneuver that you'll do in a helicopter in the event that you would, for example, lose an engine. And so there's a way to, via the controls, disconnect the engine from being what's driving the rotor blades. There's a clutch system involved. And so that frees the rotor blade, and essentially they just begin rotating in the wind. So it's like a pinwheel, where the wind coming from below is what keeps the rotor spinning. And that will allow you to land in a way that is actually a fairly gentle landing if done properly. And so there tends to be a misconception out there among people that I've heard that if the engine stops in a helicopter, that it will suddenly just become a brick and fall out of the sky. And that's absolutely not true. You can auto rotate. But we did that, and it was just an incredible experience. I mean, your descent rate in an auto rotation it varies from helicopter to helicopter. It's somewhere around 1,500 feet per minute, I want to say. So it feels a lot like falling, and it's just a tremendous amount of fun. Following that, we went back to the airport, and that's where I first got to try my hand at hovering. Now, this is where things really got interesting, because I had gone into the first flight probably too confident. I figured I'm an airplane pilot. How much harder can helicopters be? But that initial attempt at hovering was truly a humbling experience, where you learn very quickly that unlike an airplane, a helicopter is not inherently stable. I mean, if you think in terms of static and dynamic stability. So static stability is, of course, the tendency of an aircraft to, if disturbed, immediately return to the position it was in. And then dynamic stability refers to the amplitude of an aircraft over time. So as time goes on, is it more or less stable? Well, in an airplane, especially trainer aircraft like a 172, they're going to be stable. But in helicopter, when you're hovering, you do have static stability. So let's say you're hovering, a gust of wind comes up, blows you one direction. Well, the helicopter is going to want to return to the position it was initially. But dynamically, helicopters are not stable. So it's not just going to return to the position it was in, it's actually going to overshoot and then going to go back and do the same thing to the point where it's really functioning as a pendulum that is on the rotor blades. And that's known as pendular action. It's one of the things that makes it very difficult for a beginner to hover a helicopter. I know in the beginning I discovered all sorts of pendular action that you could do. And it's the kind of thing where when you're just watching a helicopter, as we often would at AOPA, Chris, when you see them practicing and they're hovering, you can immediately tell. Yeah, you can immediately tell a new helicopter pilot from one that's more experienced, because you'll just watch as they start to hover, begin to get that pendular action, and it just kind of continues to increase up until the point where you can tell the instructor takes controls and suddenly everything's smooth again. But I was not able to nail the hover on my first flight, and I found that really frustrating. And so I decided then that I was going to at least take a second flight and learn how to hover. But by the time I did a second flight, I realized I was just having far too much fun to ever stop. And so I ended up becoming a helicopter pilot then, almost by accident. It had not been something I intended to do, but it was just a tremendous amount of fun. So I did get my private add-on to my airplane certificate in 2015, in 2016, I should say. And then in October of 2019, I became a commercial helicopter pilot. It was actually my initial commercial rating. And so then I got the airplane add-on after that. One thing about getting a commercial rating or certificate, I should say, in a helicopter is that it is not all that hard. And by that, I mean, unlike in an airplane where you have to learn a whole new series of maneuvers that you perform on your commercial check ride, that really doesn't exist in helicopters. You do all same maneuvers that you did on your private check ride. You just have to do them to a tighter set of tolerances.
Cool.
So yeah, so moving on to the next slide.
Well, hang on one second there, Michael. We do have one question. Sure. Maybe you can answer that one. And we've got some other ones. By the way, a couple of comments. We have one person, Scott, was saying that hovering's been described as balancing a ball on top of another ball. And I know that Lee had mentioned too that he used to fly them and was inspired as a kid or at some point by Airwolf. You remember that show and Blue Thunder? These are shows. Yeah.
Fantastic show. Yes.
Yeah, super inspired. So the one question we have from Aaron is, why do helicopter pilots fly from the right-hand seat? And I will click the slide as you answer that one.
I know that a lot of it tends to be, let me think here. In a helicopter, one reason that pilots fly from the right-hand seat, I believe, has to do with where the flight controls are located. And we'll get into that a bit when I get to the control segment. So we'll talk about that. But it has to do with where your hand is in relation to the collective. And when you need to, you have two controls, essentially. You have a collective and a cyclic, and we'll talk about that. But the cyclic, your hand has to remain on any moment the helicopter is flying. The collective, you can remove your hand sometimes. And so the collective is your left hand. And so that will free up your left hand to manipulate some of the controls in the helicopter, like radio frequency, things like that you need to do.
I'm sorry. Nicholas just gave an answer to that one, which is the answer is because we're cooler. So that's why. All right, go ahead, Michael. Let's go to the next slide.
Sure. I like that answer, though. So going on to the maneuvers that you'll do in helicopter training, this is just a basic run through of everything that you do if you did decide to become a helicopter pilot. It's kind of like airplanes where you have a series of basic maneuvers, and then as time goes on, you start doing more advanced maneuvers. The base maneuvers, things like straight and level flight, turns, climbs, descents. You'll learn takeoffs and landings, and then you'll also learn a series of hovering maneuvers. And there are a number of hovering exercises that pilots will tend to do during their training. For example, you might make a box pattern where you're keeping the nose pointed in the same direction and you move sidewards, forwards, and then sidewards again, and then in reverse. You might make a 360-degree circle where you keep your nose pointed at the center of the circle the entire time. So just different exercises to really hone your ability to hold your hover and to be precise. And one of the most difficult things, again, that I found when I started hovering, one reason it's tough is because there's really no equivalent thing that you ever do as an airplane pilot. And I think it's something that is probably easier for someone to grasp if they're just getting into helicopters initially than if they're coming from airplanes. Because when we fly airplanes and we're making different control movements, we think in terms of moving the controls. I mean, you're pushing the yoke forward or pulling it back. Once you climb into a helicopter, if you think of moving controls, then you're already over trolling the aircraft. It should never be thought of in terms of moving. It truly is just the slightest pressure. And a lot of times it's just a thought. I mean, if you think it, that's probably enough control movement. And going from hovering, then you'll start going into the more advanced maneuvers that you'll do in a helicopter. So some of these might include reconnaissance procedures. Obviously, in a helicopter, you're not always going to be landing at an airport. You're going to be landing in a variety of areas. That's one of the things that makes helicopters so cool. And so you'll learn how to do reconnaissance, both a high reconnaissance, starting at a greater altitude over a field, but also then a lower reconnaissance, you get closer to it. And as you perform a reconnaissance, you're just looking for any aspect of the field that might make it unfavorable for landing. And it's also things that you're looking at in order to put together a strategy for landing in the field. So you're asking yourself questions like, what's the wind doing? Where is the sun? What type of surface am I going to be landing on? Is there any kind of slope? Are there any cattle or people anywhere in the vicinity? Are there any wires that I need to be watching for? And so you become very good at being vigilant at reconnoitering an area prior to setting down in it. You'll learn steep and shallow approaches. Steep approach is the kind of approach that you would need if you were going to land in a confined area. If it's surrounded on all sides and you don't have a lot of room to maneuver, you might need to make a steep landing approach into it. You'll learn max performance takeoff, which is when the helicopter essentially will just go straight up. Some people believe that that's what helicopters usually do when they take off. It's actually not. The typical way of taking off in a helicopter would be to get into a hover and then just slowly begin forward movement before you start climbing. And the reason for that is safety. I mean, you always want to leave yourself in a position where you do an auto rotation if need be, if engine quit. And to do a successful auto rotation, you need some combination of airspeed and altitude. And so if you have a higher altitude, then you don't need as much airspeed. But if you don't have much altitude, then you need more airspeed. And so that's the reason you don't frequently see helicopters take off straight up, is because anytime that they do, they're actually putting themselves, even briefly, in a zone where they have neither altitude nor the airspeed to do a successful auto rotation. So usually you try to minimize the number of max performance takeoffs that you do, but sometimes they are necessary. Again, if you were taking off from a confined area. Quick stops are a lot like what they sound like. It's bringing the helicopter to a stop very quickly. And you would use those if you were, say, taxiing or on a takeoff run and suddenly something emerged in front of you, maybe a bird, another aircraft, some vehicle that you need to suddenly abort. A quick stop would be an example of how to do that. And then finally, you'll also learn how to conduct slope and confined area operations. Personally, I know that the training process is different for everyone. For me personally, I didn't find there to be anything more difficult than a slope landing. And the
When you say
reason
that,
is,
do you mean like on a slope? Is that what you're talking about?
Exactly. If
Okay.
you're landing on an area that's not perfectly flat, but you have a slope, way that you have to handle that in a helicopter is approach it parallel to the slope, and you're going to put one skid on the slope and then very slowly lower the other skid. Now, the reason that's difficult is because while one skid is on the slope, you really have to hold just a rock solid hover. And it can be something that initially just makes you a little uneasy, but over time, like anything, you get it. It becomes easy to do. But it was definitely a maneuver that took me a little while to learn.
Cool. That sounds crazy though, the whole thing of the hover part. And you know what? Doesn't sound as crazy though. Steven, do we have anything that we could give away just in this moment?
Well, with some of the slope hovering that Michael's talking about, you definitely want to keep your hat on while you're working those maneuvers.
All right. So if you'd like a hat, make sure in the chat or in the things, put in hat. The first person that puts in hat will get a hat, and Steven will get your info from you. So there it is, everybody. All right, let's keep going on. Let's go, Michael.
Thank you, Chris. Where'd you say that chat box was again?
We can get there. It is. So we see we got some people already in there with the hat part. So they're coming in fast and furious right now. All right. And then by what somebody I mentioned, you may talk about it later, or it's right here. They were saying, could you describe what auto rotation was again? So I see it right on the list there. So that may be appropriate. Go ahead.
So in addition to all the basic and advanced maneuvers you do in a helicopter, a lot of the maneuvers that you learn are also geared toward ensuring that you remain safe, similar to those that you do in an airplane, honestly. When you think of all the times that you practice stalls or anything that is related to safety, you do that a lot in a helicopter as well. And first on the list is auto rotation. So as I said, auto rotation is something that you would do in the event that the helicopter engine were to stop. And there are a few other scenarios where you would use it as well, but I would say that loss of engine power would be far and away the most common time that you would auto rotate. And when you auto rotate, you lower the collective, which is a control I will get into shortly, but it decreases the pitch of all the blades. And then you'll also disconnect essentially the rotor system from the engine that is usually driving it. An easy way to think about this is if you're riding a bicycle, there is a gear system so that when you're pedaling forward, you're driving the wheels. But then when you stop pedaling, the wheels are going to continue to turn. And if you're going downhill, they'll continue just by way of gravity. It's not like when you stop pedaling, the bike is going to come to a screeching halt. And so similarly, the clutch system and the gear system in the helicopter allows you to do roughly the same thing. Where the engine quits, it's like it stops pedaling, but then the rotor system is able to maintain its RPM. From there, you're going to descend, and you're going to descend pretty quickly because helicopters do not have a great glide ratio. I want to say in the R-22 that I was flying, it's somewhere around 4-to-1, where you're dropping. You have a little latitude about where you can go, but not nearly as much as you would have in an airplane. Fortunately, put a helicopter down and to successfully auto rotate, you don't need nearly as much room. So if you can't find a big field, that's okay. If you can find a parking lot with enough space for the helicopter, you can probably auto rotate. But as the helicopter descends, the wind is going to be moving upward through the blade, and that is what is maintaining the RPM that you have. So if you think of a pinwheel, as you twirl it around and the wind makes the pinwheel go, it's doing the same thing to the rotors of a helicopter in an auto rotation. You will also learn how to recover from something that's called vortex ring state. This is also known as settling with power. This can occur if when you're in a helicopter, you are in a descent and you don't have a lot of forward airspeed, but you are under power. The helicopter can begin to descend into its own rotor vortices or turbulent air. And that helicopters don't like that. Once they start descending into that turbulent air, you get to a point where the way that you would initially use the controls to arrest a descent, that no longer works. And if you try it, you're only going to exacerbate the problem and begin descending faster. Now, there is a way out of vortex state, and that is to move in some direction out of it, whether it's forward or to either side, to get out of your vortices. It's a maneuver a lot like stalls, Chris, where when you practice them at altitude, there's really nothing dangerous about stall. But when is a stall most likely to occur? Most likely to occur at a point where you don't have a lot of altitude. And so settling with power is similar, where the times that you're most likely to get into it are when you're near to the ground and don't have a lot of time to recover. So just like practicing stalls, it's all about recovering quickly and not losing a lot of altitude as you do so. Dynamic rollover is something that can happen in a situation like landing on a slope, where one of your skids becomes a pivot point. And if you exceed too many degrees in rolling on that pivot point, you can get to a point where the helicopter will roll over. So that's something you just need to be aware of. It's not something you actually practice. And then similarly,
Michael, just quick time check too. We got about 29 minutes to go. And just a time check for you, because I know we've got people are asking about the controls a lot too, so I know we want to get to that. So go ahead.
I appreciate that. Yeah, we'll move quickly here. So low G conditions, that's something that you specifically want to avoid in a Robinson, which is the type of helicopter that I'm flying. If you do get into a low G scenario, there's a potential for mast bumping, which is where the rotor system actually comes into contact with the mast of the helicopter and can shear itself off. So that's a way, you obviously don't want to enter that. There's no POH checklist for once the rotor system is detached from the helicopter, but there is a way to avoid getting into it. So you become very cognizant of how to avoid that scenario. Low RPM and rotor stall, those can be dangerous situations in a helicopter. You'll also learn system malfunctions, lost procedures, and VFR to IMC, which you learn in an airplane as well.
Any pilot right there, right?
One really quick story about lost procedures that's always stuck with me. When I was doing my first cross country, I was out pre-flighting the helicopter, and the owner of the flight school came by, and he started asking me different questions about what I would do in certain scenarios. And one of them was, what would you do in the event you got lost? And I started giving him the textbook answer. You know, I would climb, I would communicate, I would confess the issue. And he said, you know, that's all well and good, but never forget you're in a helicopter. If you really lost, you can always land and ask someone where you're at, which, yeah, just really drives home how cool helicopters are. But anyway, we can go to the next slide if there are no questions about that one.
Yeah, let's go ahead and do that. And in fact, I know that too. I know you did the safety awareness, and some folks may get nervous based on that, but really you're trying to show this because of the training part. Is that right, Michael? Just kind of show you're prepared for these things. So just like we do in airplanes.
Absolutely. I mean, just like airplanes, there are certain circumstances where you can run into trouble if you're not prepared, which is why when you're doing your primary pilot certificate, on just about every flight, at some point, whoop, we just lost an engine. And so similar to that, you're going to run through all those scenarios repeatedly in a helicopter so that you're very cognizant of either how not to get into them, or if some of them do occur, how to get out of them quickly. Now, these next couple slides, I'm going to move quickly through, but I just wanted to highlight some of my favorite moments that have occurred in a helicopter. The first was a confined area landing that we did one day as I was getting my private certificate. We actually landed on a rock out in the middle of the Potomac River. And if you look at the photo on the right, that's not actually me, but it is the rock I landed on, and it is the same type of helicopter, a Robinson R-22. If you look closely enough, there's a very faint H that's etched on that rock, denoting it as a helicopter landing spot.
Oh, no way.
But yeah, that was a lot of fun. And the photo on the left was one the instructor took during that flight as I made my approach to the rock. So that's just the kind of sight picture that you don't usually see in an airplane.
Yeah.
And then moving on to the next slide is another flight that I took. This also was getting my private certificate. It was a night cross country that we did. We went from Frederick to Bay Bridge Airport, which is on the other side of the harbor from Baltimore. And so we made that trip going through the DC SIFRA. And from Bay Bridge back to Frederick, then we got clearance through the Bravo over Baltimore, and we were able to fly right over the inner harbor in Baltimore at 700 feet. And it was one of the most surreal experiences I have ever had in aviation. I mean, it felt like being in a movie or a dream or something, just flying that low over the heart of the city. So it was a lot of fun.
Very cool. And just so you know, I do see some questions coming in. I see some of these things are probably going to come up a little later. And trust me, folks, for the ones that are directly what we're talking about, I will ask Michael. But for a lot of them, I'm just kind of saving them those towards the end. All right, continue, Michael, please. Oh, by the way, I was remiss, and so let's give another opportunity out there. I said the chat. I should have said in the question box. In the question box, if you'd like a hat, put in the hat in that question box right now. First one gets a hat in the question box. All right, go ahead, Michael.
Great. So taking a brief look now at how helicopters fly. I don't know who this quote is attributed to. If anyone does, maybe throw it box, but I've heard them described as an assembly of 40,000 loose pieces flying more or less in formation. I think it's fairly accurate. There are a lot of moving parts in a helicopter. They are absolute marvels of modern engineering. And one reason is in this third bullet point. One thing that I learned as I was learning to fly a helicopter is that many parts of a helicopter or functions of a helicopter, they function to counteract forces that are caused by the functioning of other parts of the helicopter. They create a lot of their own forces. And so there's always a need to correct for them. And so a lot of the engineering behind helicopters is just finding ways to counteract forces the helicopter itself is creating. Brief disclaimer at the bottom, and this is especially true since we are going to be a little short on time. I want to emphasize that discussion of helicopter controls and aerodynamics is going to be vastly simplified. I know there are people out there in the audience that fly helicopters. They understand these things to a much higher degree. And so you're going to realize there are a lot of things that I'm either not talking about or talking about in a very simplified way, but that's why. In order to go into more depth, we would need a much, much longer webinar. So going to the next slide.
Okay.
Just looking at the basic components of a rotorcraft, you're going to have the fuselage, the landing gear. Now, helicopters might have a wheeled landing gear. They might have skids. There's a tail boom and tail rotor. A power plant, it can be either piston, like the helicopters that I've flown before. You can also have turbine helicopters. And there's going to be some kind of main rotor system. On the next slide.
Oh, so I'm just also marking off a good question there.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go. There you go.
Sure. So looking at how helicopters produce, now this is actually very simple because they do it in the same way that airplanes do it. If you think of a helicopter rotor just as a much different kind of wing, it is really just an airfoil. So it's moving through the air quickly and generating lift. Because rotors don't have a lot of surface area, that is one reason that they need to move so quickly through the air. For those of you that remember the lift equation, you'll understand that relationship. But the big difference between helicopters and airplanes is that in an airplane, what's providing thrust and what's providing lift are two totally different systems. You have the wings providing lift, and then you have the propeller that's providing the thrust. In a helicopter, the main rotor system is providing both the thrust and the lift, so that all occurs within one system.
Cool.
Moving on.
There you go.
Sure.
This is the stuff I know they want to know about.
Starting to look at the helicopter controls. Yes, so there are 3 controls that you're going to use to control a helicopter. One's called a collective, one is called a cyclic, and then the other are anti-torque pedal. It can be easy for us who have flown airplanes before to think of them as rudder pedals. They aren't truly rudder pedals. They're actually anti-torque pedals that control the tail rotor. But the collective is a device on the rotor system. You're going to have a device called a swash plate. And this is what modifies the pitch of all the blades, or the angle of incidence, if you will. It can do that either collectively or individually. So when you move the collective control, as it sounds, what you're doing is you're changing the pitch of all the rotor blades collectively. So this is the control that physically is on the left side of the pilot. It's a bar and it moves up and down. And quite simply, that's what's making the helicopter go either up or down. You're increasing the angle of incidence and hence the angle of attack on all the blades simultaneously. Also on the collective, we're going to have the helicopter's throttle control. So you can either increase or decrease that. As you increase the pitch of the blades, you're also going to have to increase the amount of power that you're providing to the engine because you're going to have more drag comes with that additional lift. Now, the way that the throttles work kind of varies from helicopter to helicopter. So in the R-22 that I flew, there's actually a correlator, which is a mechanical linkage from the throttle to the engine, which makes it easier to keep engine in the approximate range it needs to be. There's also an electronic governor, which is going to help you with the throttle as you change the collective. So that makes it easier to fly. Not every helicopter has that. Some you have to do more manual manipulation of the throttle controls as you maneuver or as you manipulate the collective. So that's the collective. And then going on to the next slide, we're going to be talking about the cyclic. So the cyclic is typically a stick that is going to be in front of the pilot, and he's going to use his right hand to control the cyclic. It can go in any direction. And what it's doing is manipulating the swash plate in a way that's going to alter the pitch of individual rotor blades. And so this is going to tilt the arc of the main rotor. And as it does so, it's going to in turn tilt the lift vector. And so that's what's going to allow you to move in any direction. And a helicopter can move in any direction. The aircraft does not care which direction it's moving. So going forward or backward, either side, all of that is controlled using the cyclic. And again, the key to cyclic, especially if you're an airplane pilot, very, very small control movements.
Somebody I know earlier said like they use the force, Luke. They said think of it that way. I think that was Scott. So okay, here we go. Next one.
Sure. So this is just the first example of the ways in which helicopters are engineered, where one thing on the helicopter is creating a force that something else has to compensate for. In this case, it's the effect of torque. Now, as the rotors are moving one direction and the engine is driving them, the helicopter, due to Newton's third law, where for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction, if the rotors are turning counterclockwise, which they do on all US helicopters, a lot of European models, they turn clockwise, but that's a different question. But if the rotors are turning counterclockwise, the fuselage wants to turn clockwise. And so there has to be some way to counteract this tendency, and that is done through the tail rotor. So the tail rotor is really just providing thrust in order to keep the fuselage, the helicopter, from spinning wildly through the air. And you manipulate the amount of thrust the tail rotor is providing through the rudder pedals. So that's what those rudder pedals, even I am saying rudder pedals, that's what those high torque pedals are actually manipulating. See how easy it is to do?
Mm-hmm. And I can't believe I know that. All right, let's go to that next one.
I won't go too deep into this, but basically, even though rotors aren't gyroscopes, they do function similarly to gyroscopes, where any force that's applied, you're going to see the resulting effect of that 9 degrees later in its plane of rotation. So when the swash plate is moved in order to, for example, make the helicopter go forward, the controls are, what it's actually doing is manipulating the rotors at a point at the 3 o'clock. So 9 degrees prior to when they get to the point where they actually need to provide that tilt. And so that's another way in which helicopter controls are very intricately engineered in order to allow the helicopter to move.
No kidding. No kidding. All right, to go to the next one?
Yep.
All right.
So a brief discussion about rotor lift, and I've got the lift equation there. Everyone who is an airplane pilot, I'm sure, is familiar with this well, but the variable that you have to manipulate are the coefficient of lift, which also can be thought of as your angle of attack, your velocity, air density, and the surface area of a wing. Now, there are a couple of questions that are on the slide. So how might the fact that a helicopter's rotor blades are constantly changing direction affect the amount of lift that each blade experiences? And there are two situations that are given on the slide. How would this affect the rotor's amount of lift that they're both experiencing in a hover on a calm day? And how would this affect the amount of lift they're experiencing if the helicopter's in forward flight? And the answers to those questions, on a calm day, really there is no difference between the amount of lift that the two blades are experiencing. If you're not, if you're in a hover, you're not moving in any direction, and it's calm, both rotors are experiencing the same amount of lift. However, as soon as you begin flying in any direction, forward flight is just an example, then there becomes an inequality, or a dissymmetry, if you will, between the amount of lift that the two rotors are experiencing. And I'll get more into that on the next slide.
All right, let's do it. There we go.
Okay, so dissymmetry of lift. As a helicopter begins to gain airspeed in any direction, there's always going to be one blade that is advancing and one that is retreating. And that's in relation to the direction of flight that we use those terms advancing and retreating. So for example, in the example there on the right, if the helicopter is moving forward, then the blade on the right side of the helicopter would be the advancing blade, and the blade on the left side of the helicopter would be the retreating blade. As I said, if the helicopter's in motion, there's going to be an inequality or dissymmetry between the lift that both are experiencing, because the advancing rotor, due to the fact it has more relative wind because of the airspeed of the helicopter as it moves through the air, that's going to be able to produce more lift than the retreating blade. The next slide gets into this in a bit more detail and actually provides an example to make it easier to grasp, I think. So here we assign some airspeeds to it. Say that the helicopter is moving through the air at 100 knots, but the blade tip speed is 400 knots. What you're going to do is add that speed of forward flight to the advancing blade. So as far as that blade is concerned, it's moving through the air at 500 knots. On the retreating side, though, you have to subtract that forward airspeed, because as far as that blade is concerned, as far as the relative wind, it's only experiencing 300 knots. Now, what happens when one blade is moving through the air more quickly than the other? Thinking back to the lift equation, you have less velocity. And so that blade is going to be experiencing more lift. Now, the question is, how do you counter that? Because you can't have a helicopter that's simply rolling in the air with one side of it always experiencing more lift. You'd never be able to fly. So there has to be a way to counteract this. Helicopters are able to counteract this. If you go on the next slide, you can see how this problem is solved. So this goes into how imagery of lift is compensated for. Going back to the lift equation, you only have 4 variables that you could possibly manipulate. And 2 of them are things that you're never going to be able to manipulate in a helicopter. You can't change surface area of your rotor. You also are not going to be changing the air density. It's just a given. So now down to 2 variables. You have velocity and the coefficient of lift. Velocity is already the problem. That has been increased on one side. And so how do you counteract that to maintain an equal amount of lift? Well, you have to counteract it by changing the angle of attack of the other blade. And so in order to do this, helicopter blades are allowed to flap. There's different mechanisms that do this. It varies from helicopter to helicopter. Every helicopter has some way in which the blades are able to flap up and down, acting almost as a teeter-totter. So as the right blade flaps up, the left blade's flapping down, and vice versa. So what is happening here? Well, basically, on the side where the blade is moving faster, it has more lift, so it's flapping up. But as it flaps up, what is happening is it's meeting the relative wind in a way that decreases its angle of attack because it's moving upward. And so that is going to cause it to begin to fall then. And on the other side of the helicopter, when you get to the retreating side, the blade is actually moving downward, but that downward motion is causing a greater angle of attack between the blade and the relative wind. And so in doing this, by using the angle of attack to counteract the discrepancy in velocity, you're keeping lift constant. And it's just another fascinating way in which helicopters are engineered to counteract forces that the helicopter itself is creating.
Sorry, and Michael, so one person, are you gonna, two things. One person's asking about, are you gonna talk anything about retreating blade stalls as we move forward, or?
I am. That is actually exactly where we're going next. So that makes for a perfect
Woo-hoo!
segue. Retreating
And then-
blade stall.
And just real quick,
Yes.
I did have a question about the graphics too. We'll see if we can get a PDF out. There is a handout, and probably some of these types of graphics are in that helicopter flying handbook. You might want to check there, but we'll see if we can make a PDF of some of this. We just have to check on the permissions with the graphics first, though. But if we can, we will put them with the YouTube video if we are able to do that.
Yeah, and just as a very quick plug for AOPA's high school program, a lot of these slides on helicopter aerodynamics are actually pulled out of a presentation for high schoolers in that program. So it does illustrate the quality of the lessons and give some sense of what high schoolers are seeing. Moving on to retreating blade stall. So flapping is only going to be effective up to a point. And you can think of this in airplane terms, Chris. As you begin slow flight, what do you need to do to your angle of attack in order to maintain altitude?
You got to pull back, got to increase.
Exactly. You have to start increasing that angle of attack as your airspeed gets slower. However, that's only going to be effective up to a point, because you reach a point where airflow is simply no longer achievable over the wings and you stall. What you're seeing in the rotors is the same thing, where the retreating rotor is counteracting for its loss of airspeed by increasing its angle of attack. That's only going to be effective up to a point. So you're going to get to a point where the retreating blade is going to stall. Now, this is actually not one of the more serious types of stalls that you could have in a helicopter, because it really is self-correcting. If you get into a retreating blade stall, the way that the helicopter is going to react is sort of pitch up and back. And so that is going to slow you down by itself, which is going to correct the problem. But one thing about retreating blade stall is it's one of the primary things behind determining what a helicopter's top speed is. And I think one of the most interesting things when you think of military helicopters and you think of which ones are the fastest helicopter in the military's arsenal right now is the Chinook, which is huge. I mean, it's the big dual rotor helicopter, and it's actually able to fly faster than, say, a Black Hawk or an Apache. And the reason is because with the two rotors that are moving they're moving counter to each other. When that happens, you don't actually have a true retreating blade, because on both sides, one blade is retreating, but the other blade is advancing. And so retreating blade stall does not become the kind of prohibition on airspeed that it is in a typical helicopter.
Interesting.
Moving forward. I won't linger on this too long. This was just one example of how a helicopter is a puzzle of interrelated forces. And it's one of the hardest things when you're first learning to fly a helicopter, is that any control movement that you make is going to immediately impact other controls that you also need to do. I've heard it likened to a Rubik's Cube, and I think that's a pretty good analogy, where you maneuver one variable and you're changing other things. So in the example here, you're climbing, so you're increasing the angle of attack with the collective. But as you do that, you're also going to need to increase the throttle, because you're going to need more power in order to climb. Also, as you climb and you increase engine power, you're increasing the amount of torque that the helicopter is experiencing. And so that's going to make it want to spin more, which you're going to have to counteract with the anti-torque pedal. And also, as you do that, you're increasing the thrust to the anti-torque pedal. The helicopter is going to want to do something that's called translating tendency, where the rear rotor actually begins to function as a propeller and move the helicopter sideways. And so you're going to have to counteract that movement with the cyclic. And so over time, all these things just become innate and they become intuitive and like muscle memory. But the road to getting there is what makes flying a helicopter difficult, at least initially.
Cool. All right. And obviously that sounds like sort of like right rudder, but to an nth degree, obviously.
Exactly.
To the next slide here.
No, that's a good parallel in airplanes, absolutely. I'm going to talk fairly quickly about these, but I do want to touch upon some of the similarities that exist between airplanes and helicopters. If any of you are airplane pilots that are interested in maybe getting into helicopters, or vice versa, if you're a helicopter pilot thinking about learning to fly an airplane, the
And we
areas
did have
of
lots of questions about that journey of like if you're an airplane pilot and so on. So go ahead.
Perfect. So the areas of overlap that you're going to have is the knowledge areas, speaking very broadly, are going to be the same. The things that you need to learn for the written test, a lot of those knowledge areas are going to be the same. Things like weather theory, weather products, things like navigation and communication skills, which are also up there. All those skills, if you have them in an airplane, they're going to translate directly to the helicopter, because communicating really doesn't change depending on type of aircraft you're in. The only thing that does change is it's a bit harder to change the radio frequency in a helicopter. You have to do that much more strategically and be thinking even more ahead of aircraft than you are in an airplane. But other than that, no real difference. A lot of airport operations overlap. When you learn things like airport signage and markings and the dangers of runway incursions, all that's going to be the same whether you're in an airplane or a helicopter. A lot of regulations, the vast majority, are going to be the same regardless of the type of aircraft that you're flying. So, and risk management principles as well that are up there. The risk matrix, how to mitigate risk. There's a lot of areas of overlap. So if you're already an airplane pilot and you're very familiar with regulations, you're good at navigation and communication skills, you feel up to date on all the knowledge areas, then you're certainly going to be a bit ahead of the game when you transition to helicopters, and vice versa, helicopters to airplanes. But that being said, there are some differences as well, and I have some of those listed on the next slide, Chris.
And just as we go there, Michael, too, Robert does mention here, he says it's probably pretty important to mention that helicopter pilots and fixed wing pilots should definitely stay in different patterns because they are so different in terms of performance.
Yes, absolutely. And that is actually something I think that is in the next slide that I was going to cover, where we start looking at the differences between airplanes and helicopters. So I'm going to start out with aerodynamics and systems. Now, I've already talked a good amount about that during this presentation, so I'm not going to delve into it too much, but simply the control movements that you need in order to maneuver a helicopter, to hover, to control it in various phases of flight. All that's going to be very different if you are an airplane pilot. There's not a lot of overlap there, so there are a lot of new skills you're going to need to learn. Also, emergency procedures, I touched on those earlier. The emergency procedures do differ between helicopters and airplanes. There are a number of things that you could get into in a helicopter that would never be a factor in an airplane, and vice versa. So you're going to be learning those for the category of aircraft they're in. And then the two bottom points here, I realize were both also on the other slide. And that is because there's some areas in which they're the same, and there are also areas in which they are different. And airport operations, as the commenter said, is one area where there are differences as well. Basically, the regulations for airport operations just say that as a rotorcraft pilot, you're to stay out of the way of fixed wing patterns. And so you have more latitude as to how you fly to a non-towered airport, though what you're going to do is be careful to avoid the airplane traffic pattern. So for example, if the default pattern for airplanes is left traffic at a given airport, you're going to want to make right traffic as a helicopter pilot, unless it says otherwise somewhere in the airport directory. So you do always be looking for that still and making sure you're reading ahead. In addition to that, there are things you can do at an airport that differ in a helicopter. For example, you are actually able to land and take off on T-ways. You don't need a runway. So you have a lot more latitude when it comes to the places you can arrive from, at or depart from. And then finally, regulations. Those are going to... Oh, no worries. I'll move through them quickly. But I do want to highlight the fact that there are some differences in regulations between airplanes and helicopters. For example, the fuel requirements in VFR flight, you only need 20 minutes of fuel left if you're a helicopter pilot, which is because you really can put a helicopter down pretty much anywhere at any time. The special VFR weather minimums and the weather minimums themselves are going to be different in a helicopter in Class G airspace if you're below 1,200 feet AGL. So helicopters are only going to need to remain clear clouds and have at least a half mile of visibility during the day and 1 mile of visibility at nighttime. A couple other things, minimum safe altitudes don't apply to helicopters in the same way that they do to airplanes, because obviously helicopters can land anywhere. A lot of what they do is performing operations in areas that are away from an airport. And so you're able to descend as long as you're not putting anyone into danger lower than you could in an airplane. And also the regulations when it comes to operating in airspace, like we said above on the previous bullet point, as long as you're staying out of the way of fixed wing traffic, typically you're going to be okay.
Next one. And I know we're right at the end of our
slide.
time here, so I know you'll wrap it up real quick, Michael, and then we'll get to questions here shortly, and we'll end the webinar in just a moment.
Absolutely. So just going into why fly helicopters. First and foremost, helicopters are a lot of fun. You can do so many things in them, whether it's the ways they can maneuver, the fact that you can land in a field outside an airport. There's just a tremendous amount of you can do. You can fly low. They're great for low-level sightseeing. They're challenging. You're going to learn new skills in a helicopter that you have never performed before in an airplane. They offer a different perspective of the world, and some of the things to learn in a helicopter are also going to bleed into the way they fly airplanes. At least that's what I found for me. Just a couple very brief examples. For example, when I talked about how you get a lot better at doing various levels of reconnaissance over field, say an emergency situation, you really hone that skill in helicopters, and that would come in very handy in an airplane. If you're ever to lose an engine, you become very good at quickly evaluating what the best fields to land in are. Also, when I started to fly helicopters, I became much more cognizant of the types of areas I was flying over in the event that I would lose an engine, because you don't have much glide ratio. And so instead of hitting direct to and following the magenta line in a helicopter, I'm much more careful. Not sure what I was trying to say there. Much more careful about strategizing how I'm going to get somewhere and making sure that there's always somewhere under me that I could auto rotate to. If I have to deviate a few miles from my flight path just to make sure that I'm over an area I could get down safely, I'll do that. And since I started flying helicopters, it's something I've also become much more cognizant of in airplanes. I'm much more vigilant when it comes to looking at making sure I'm flying over airports or other areas where I could make safe emergency landing if I need to. I don't just hit direct to anymore. I tend to be more careful about manipulating my route in a way that's going to give me a safe outcome where I ever lose an engine. There are a lot of diverse career opportunities available in the world of helicopters, everything from flying to and from oil rig, sightseeing, medevac, their careers in the military. There are a lot of things you can do in a helicopter, and a lot of really interesting type of flying that you can do for anyone that is interested in going into a helicopter career. And then finally, the last bullet point I wanted to make, the same as the first one, helicopters are a tremendous amount of fun, and that's really far and away the reason that I love to fly them.
Very cool. Hey, Michael, thank you. I know we're going to stick around here for questions. We just want to wrap things up for the folks that need to log off, maybe on their lunch break. So just really quick, if you are not an AOPA member, and we're hoping that most of you are, but if by some chance you're not, we would love to have you as part of the AOPA family. So there's lots of great benefits here, obviously bringing things to you like Don't Get Rusty, although it is funded by the AOPA Foundation. We are also all part of AOPA here, and so we got lots of great resources for you. So check it out, aopa.org/membership. And our next episode coming up next month, July 18th, 2024, 12 to 1 Eastern, It's you spin me round, baby, right now. It's just you spin me round, spins and how to stay out of trouble. We did one on stalls not that long ago, and we want to know about spins. The really cool thing is we have a special guest coming on for that one too, Catherine Cavagnero coming on. She is a like a spin doctor. She teaches this stuff at her school down, I believe it's in Tennessee. So really, that'll be an exciting one too. So join us that. And if you have any ideas for future topics, you can let us know in the chat or at ftinitiative@aopa.org. Real quick, also, wait, a couple things. People asking about the recording. Yes, it is being recorded. It'll be on our AOPA pilot video YouTube channel. And also, I believe it's webinars.aop.org. But don't hold me to that. I know there's a webinar section on the AOPA website. Yeah, did I say that correctly, Stephen?
Believe so, yes.
Yes, okay. And I think that's the basic parts of it. I don't think I missed anything else. And for the wings credit, I know Stephen in the chat section, you should be able to click on, he put a link there to a form in case you're wondering, did you use your FAAsafety.gov email? There's a form you can fill out there to put that request in. And we do see the questions. I'm going to go back and I'm going to do the best I can. And yes, Scott, ForeFlight works in helicopters too. Let's see here. The biggest thing I've noticed a definite theme of questions, Michael, about training, about the cost, especially for folks that already have a airplane. So it's just kind of like you did. You had your airplane pilot certificate, and they're kind of wondering what does that look like, and what about the costs and things like that. And are there written tests? So just some of those highlights. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. Yeah, I can answer some of those questions. First, if you already have a pilot certificate in any category of aircraft, so for example, you've got your private pilot certificate in airplanes, then if you get an add-on in helicopters, you do not need to take the written test again. So that is definitely a nice benefit of already being a pilot, and vice versa. If you're already a helicopter pilot, get your airplane add-on, you aren't going to need to take the airplane written. For the other part of what you were asking, if you are, say that you're an airplane pilot and you want to start flying helicopters, I believe it is 30 hours in helicopters that you would need as being the minimum to get your certificate. And whether or not that actually is the number of hours it's going to take, it's just like flight training in airplanes, it's really going to depend. The more that you do your lessons, the higher frequency of your training, the more you're going to retain, and the fewer hours you're going to need in order to get your add-on. For me personally, I didn't have a lot of time to dedicate to training. I do it after work, but in different times of the year, the weather would just be not good for large swaths of the year. And so I think it took me about 50 hours in order for me to get my helicopter add-on, but you could certainly do it in less if you have an airplane certificate already, as long as you do a fairly high frequency of training. In terms of the cost, I hesitate to put dollar figures on it because I know that costs vary so much in different parts of the country. And I'm also sure that the cost of training initially has changed even from the time that I've done it. I mean, everything is getting more expensive, fortunately. But I would say that helicopters were quite a bit more per hour than airplanes. I flew in a Robinson R-22, which was about the most economical helicopter that you're going to be able to find to train in. And I think that some of the rates last time I checked in, really in your neck of the woods, Chris, were about $375 an hour for an R-22 flight. So
and that's not including instructor, I assume, just for the helicopter, or is that included?
I don't believe so.
Okay.
It's going to be somewhere in that neighborhood, probably between $350 and $400 an hour, I would estimate.
Cool. We had a question here, and I'm not sure if you'll know any kind of answer to this. I know you used to work in the flying clubs, but they had a question. Are there any helicopter flying clubs or that have helicopters in their fleet?
There are none I am aware of. It would be so cool if there were a helicopter flying club. I remember that when I was in flying clubs, we had someone at one point that was very interested in forming a flying club around a helicopter. And I was a helicopter pilot at the time. I really wanted to see if there was a way to make that happen. I think that the biggest stumbling block there had to do with insurance. And unfortunately, that is simply because helicopters in flying clubs are such an unknown quantity when it comes to the insurer's perspective. There aren't flying clubs with helicopters, generally speaking. And so it's very hard for them to insure a helicopter in a flying club, unfortunately. Now, at least that was the case when I was in flying clubs, which is probably around 2017 or so, and I last did the research. That could have changed by now. There could be some flying clubs out there flying helicopters, and if so, that's awesome.
And fair enough. And of course, what you could do is if you're trying to look for one of those, you can, we have a flying clubs team here. Well, it's CADE. And so there's a flying club finder, AOPA flying club finder. You can either navigate to that on the AOPA website or just Google AOPA flying club finder. And then they should have a way to that. Or like I said, you could also contact our flying clubs team here. CADE Hale is the guy to speak with. Here's a question. It says, if you have the option of landing on a slope with nose facing uphill, would you do it?
No, not typically how you're going to land on a slope, because there'd be too much risk of striking the tail, really. You're always going to approach a slope from the side and land parallel to the slope. That's going to allow you to do it in a much more controlled manner.
Okay, fair enough.
So
Here's one that
you
says,
can have either side facing the slope. That's something that you could vary, but it's always going to be starting by approaching the slope parallel. You're never going to land downhill or uphill.
okay, and it's about getting control, is putting the one skid down under control and then slowly lowering, which you probably would not be able to do, obviously, if you're putting both down, right? Or parts of them. Is it legal to land a helicopter anywhere? Neighbor's front yard, cul-de-sac, vacant field? What are the restrictions on that?
I'm not aware of any regulatory restrictions. FAA does allow for the landing of helicopters pretty much anywhere. And when you see the reason why, a lot of it is practical. When you think of the uses that helicopters have, for example, medevac, you never know where you're going to need to land exactly. And so there needs to be that freedom for helicopters to be able to put down anywhere that they deem safe. Now, that being said, you are going to need permission from the landowner. I mean, there are other things that could come into play there where you can't just say I can land anywhere because I'm in a helicopter. You're always going to want to get permission for places that you can land, but there are some really cool destinations that you can go as a helicopter pilot. I know that there were some restaurants near where we were in Frederick, Chris, that had a helicopter friendly policy where they would have an area you could take your helicopter and land and go in and eat, which is always fun to do.
No kidding. That's crazy. I had saw this happen a couple. I'm just going back through systematically, but a couple of times people asked, "Will the clutch disengage automatically on engine failure?"
It's something that you're going to need to manipulate the controls to do. So you're going to roll off the throttle, and then you're also going to roll into what's called a detent position, which is located on the collective. And you're going to need to do that in order to disengage the correlator from the engine as you
So
enter
something
an
you've
auto
got to do.
rotation.
It won't just do
So
it by
it's
itself.
something you need to do, and you're going to need to do it quickly. I mean, that's one thing I didn't really emphasize in helicopters, but one reason that you practice auto rotations so often is because they do require some finesse, and you don't have a lot of time in which to enter one. So if you ever do lose an engine, you need to immediately lower the collective, roll off the throttle into the detent, and get into a position where you can begin a safe auto rotation.
Here's another one on auto rotation. It says, doesn't the upward wind flow on the rotor want to turn the blades in the opposite direction during an auto rotation, or does the pitch of the rotor blade go in the opposite direction? How does that?
Oh, I mean, you want to flatten the pitch of the rotor blade. And so any angle of attack that you had in the blades when you lose your engine, you're immediately going to lower the collective, which is going to take the angle to 0. And so you'll flatten that pitch. The windmilling effect as you begin an auto rotation and the wind is moving upward through blades, that does not make the blades want to move in the opposite direction. They'll continue to move in the same direction and at the same speed.
Cool. And I can see what you're thinking there too. So thinking like the what do you want to call that? The little leaves that fall or whatever. I can see how he's thinking like, well, it's going one way, wouldn't it go the opposite way?
Yeah, that's actually something that I had, be perfectly honest, I'd never thought of before. It is a question where I'm
corkscrews. I'm thinking of corkscrews.
But I do know that is not what occurs.
Cool. So that would be a good one to kind of investigate. That sounds interesting. I love that aerodynamic type of stuff. So that might be a good one for who was that's asked that one? That was Kevin. Maybe Kevin could look into that and find out some more. Is it normal? Never mind. We already answered that one. So let me just keep going down. Here's one. Is the potential for mast bumping something that cannot be eliminated at the design time of a helicopter? And actually, is that normal for most helicopters, or is that kind of an R22 thing? Or
so helicopters, and this is something I didn't get into very much detail in the presentation, just because it would be its own topic that you could spend a lot of time on. But helicopters do have different types of rotor systems. And the reason for that is each type of rotor system is accounting for different things that the blades need to do in a slightly different way. So for example, when I talked about blade flapping, every helicopter has to allow for that. But some rotor systems, the blades are simply going to bend up and down because they're strong enough in order to accommodate that. Other helicopters, like the Robinson, is going to be a teetering rotor system. So it's going to go back and forth. Now, because of the unique design of the Robinson rotor systems, which you see in both the R22 and also the R44, that potential is allowed for mast bumping. And it's why, if you look in the FARs, there are special FARs for Robinson helicopters specifically. And I'm not aware of any other aircraft that exists that has its own special FARs the way that Robinsons do. And the reason for that is because there are additional training requirements and currency requirements that you need if you're flying a Robinson that you wouldn't need in other helicopters. Now, a quick word on Robinsons. I'm a huge fan of Robinsons. I think the R22 and the R44 are both phenomenal helicopters. They're a lot of fun to fly. They are designed to do well. But part of the issues with Robinson is the helicopters were initially designed to be lightweight commuter type helicopters. They were not designed to be train helicopters. However, simply because they are among the most economical helicopter that you're going to be able to find, they ended up taking on a role as training helicopters. But they aren't training helicopters for the reasons that, like a Cessna 172 is a training airplane where it's easier to fly. In fact, Robinsons are very demanding helicopters to fly, and they aren't incredibly forgiving. So they demand a lot of respect, they demand a lot of proficiency. If flown properly, they're not going to give you any issues and you're not going to run into mast bumping. But in those early years, there were quite a few training issues that emerged. And so that's why you have things like those special FARs that are there for Robinson helicopters. But one thing that you learn when you're training in either an R22 or an R44 is how to avoid mast bumping. Like I said, the issue occurs if you get into a low G situation, but that doesn't mean that once you are in a low G situation, you're immediately in danger of mast bumping.
Okay.
What you're in danger of is actually the helicopter rolling very quickly to the right. And the reason for that is what happens when you get into a low G situation in a Robinson is that, in essence, rotor system is no longer pulling the helicopter through the air. They're acting more or less independently. And when that happens, the thrust from the tail rotor is going to make the aircraft want to roll very rapidly. Now, the tendency, if the helicopter begins a very quick right roll for most pilots, is going to be to move the stick to the left. The stick is what I mean by the stick there. And if you do that, you can very quickly exceed the amount of range that you should actually be entering as a control input. And that is where you could have a mass bumping situation. So if you are in a low G situation, you always want to be ready for the potential of that right roll. If you feel it, you want to pull backward on the cyclic. And if you do that, you're going to avert anything catastrophic. It's really only if you begin your correction improperly that you would run into a mass bumping situation. So that might be more detailed than he wanted, but that's what's behind mass bumping in Robinsons.
All right, so moving on past some of that, because we're getting past the section where we were talking about that. After getting a private, can you rent a helicopter? Is that something that's is possible?
Might depend on the flight school. I can only speak for the school that I attended, but yes, once I got my private certificate, I was able to rent a helicopter. I was not able to fly solo at night, but I was able to rent a helicopter, go out flying, take friends flying, do all those things.
Okay, cool. I'm not sure if this is something, and we could keep this one brief too, but what's the procedure if you lose your tail rotor? Is that something where you're able to control it all, or is that uncontrollable at that point? If that were to happen?
What you would do at that point, you would perform an auto rotation. When I had initially talked about a rotation, I had said loss of engine power isn't the only time that you perform one. And an example of another situation where you would perform one would be loss of tail rotor. Now, if you lose your tail rotor and you're not in a place that's good to perform an auto rotation, you can actually still do forward flight, because due to weathercock stability, if you're moving the airplane forward, it's going to streamline the tail and you're not going to have to worry about spinning. Spinning is only something that is going to occur once you lose that forward airspeed and come to a hover. And so what you would do if you lost your tail rotor is you would first fly to a location that was ideal for an auto rotation. If there was an airport not far away, I'd probably make for the airport. And then once I got to a point where I was ready to perform an auto, I would do that. And that would be how you would safely land the helicopter.
Cool. Not sure if you'll know this one, but this was an interesting one from Santos. She says, is the symmetry of lift similar to dihedral effect in fixed wing airplanes?
A good question. I mean, I could reason it out. To be honest, up front, I'm not entirely certain.
That's fair. No worries. It's like
I don't want to
be
in danger of making things up here.
Yeah, we don't want to do that. Yeah. In fact, what we could potentially do there is it's like you could also check. I know we've got some helicopter folks in our pilot information center, so give them a call at 1-800-USA-AOPA, and we can research that one for you. 1-800-USA-AOPA. All right, what mechanism causes the blade to flap? Susan asks.
That is simply a hinge that allows the blade flap, or depending on the type of rotor blade, again, some are actually able to bend. So the mechanism itself is going to vary from helicopter to helicopter. But one important thing to remember about flapping is however it is accomplished mechanically, whether it's through a flapping hinge on a helicopter or it's just a blade that's able to flap, it's always something that's going to occur automatically and without any pilot input, because it's something that's occurring every time the rotor goes around. So there would be no way that a pilot could manually control flapping. It's simply built into the engineering of the helicopter, and however it's able to be accomplished, it will occur.
Cool. Here's what, and I was actually wondering this, and I didn't ask it because I just wanted to let you go. But does the rotor tip, and Dan asked this as well, does the rotor tip break the sound barrier ever?
Ideally, no.
So it is possible.
I believe it is possible in some helicopters, though it's not something that is desirable. But the rotor tip is, of course, the fastest moving part of a helicopter's rotor system. It's going to be moving much faster than the inner part of a rotor blade. And so I think it would be conceivably possible. I hope I'm right about that.
Okay. Here's one. I'm not sure if you'll know this particular one, but it says, does the dual blade Russian Ka-52, I imagine maybe this is one of the stacked helicopters with it. They have some that are, does that avoid that retreating blade stall issue?
Does, and it does it in the same way. Whether a helicopter has rotors that are counter-rotating, which is the two rotors that are moving opposite to each other, mounted in different areas of the helicopter, or whether they're contra-rotating, which is when they're mounted on the same mast, they're still moving in different directions. Either way, you're eliminating the problem with dissymmetry of lift and consequently with retreating blade stall.
Cool. And
also, you're eliminating the problem of torque. So if a helicopter has two rotors that are moving different directions, you're not going to need a tail rotor as well because torque is no longer an issue. It cancels itself out.
When I was out in Arizona at Deer Valley, I remember they had some police helicopters that had gyros in the back instead of a tail rotor that did the same thing. So I thought that was pretty cool. Yeah.
There are different types of helicopters with different technology, and they account for that work in different ways. It's just currently where we're at, tail rotor is still far and away the most popular or common way to prevent torque impacting a helicopter.
Since the angle of attack on the blades is variable, and we're talking here about the retreating blade thing again, why not deal with the advancing retreating blade by varying angle of attack rather than flap?
Well, actually, you are. I mean, what they might mean is by varying the angle of incidence, which is the mechanical angle in the blade. But that's not actually necessary because when the blades flap, that is impacting the angle of attack. I mean, even though it's through a flapping up and down as to meet the relative wind, what you're manipulating is still the angle of attack. So in the end, that has the same effect.
Now I'm slowly getting towards the end here, and I know we've only got about 4 minutes left in our time, but it says, how difficult is it to switch between a main rotor clockwise rotor? I don't know if you've done this or not, so it's okay if you haven't, but he wants to know how difficult is it to switch between main rotor clockwise rotorcraft and a counterclockwise one? This goes into that training, actually. I don't know if you've experienced that or not, but.
Sure. I mean, initial disclaimer, I have not done that. So I can only logic out the theory behind it, but a lot of the forces that you would be familiar with in a helicopter where blades are going counterclockwise would suddenly be opposite. If the blades went clockwise, a lot of the forces are going to be the opposite forces that you were used to before. So I think that there would be some initial a learning curve, at least, as you from that new muscle memory to get used to the way the forces are interacting with the helicopter. But it's certainly something you could do.
Cool. And then let me just see, I'm just getting down to the end here. Are flight plans filed any differently for helicopters than they would be for airplanes?
VFR flight plans are not that I'm aware of. I will say that I don't have my instrument rating in a helicopter. I have an airplane instrument. When I was learning helicopters, I went straight from private to commercial there. So I'm not actually aware of whether or not there would be a flight plan different if you were on instrument.
Okay. And I'm just some other ones here. I tell you what we'll do is while I look through these last little bits, for the folks that are sticking around, we still have over 300 folks sticking around here. I tell you what, how about, Stephen, do we have anything else to give away?
Well, yeah, Michael was talking about some of the costs of this. For any of the folks out there looking to get started, I've got some extra shirts for them so they can all have the money left over to do their training with.
So shirt, if you'd like a shirt, put it in the question box. Let me just see. Let me just see if there's anything else here in the questions I wasn't able to look at while I was looking at the other ones. Yeah, it said that insurance is the issue. Somebody mentions about the flying clubs. What are actually, there's an interesting one. Do you know any about realistic low time employment options that helicopter pilots might get? And how many more hours do you need to get your commercial certificate?
Commercial number of hours, I believe, is the same as it would be for airplanes. So you're going to need the 250 hours to get your commercial of total time. You would have to look at the regs to determine precisely how many of those hours have to be in a helicopter specifically versus how many of those hours could just be in a powered aircraft. Off the top of my head, I don't remember all the intricacies of the regulations, but you can find that within the FARs. In answer to the question about low time helicopter jobs, similar to airplane jobs, where I would say far and away the most common job the low time pilot is going to have is as a flight instructor. So a lot of the lowest time helicopter jobs are going to be flight instructing jobs. You might also be able to do some low time touring. I mean, if you're offering tours, say of the Grand Canyon or something in that realm, but there aren't a lot of low time jobs that are available to helicopter pilots. I will say that. Usually it's around 1,000 hours where you are able to start being hired for other opportunities. And I know that one common type of job that pilots are able to get usually around 1,000 hours is flying in the Gulf. So to and from oil rigs tends to be a job that doesn't require quite as much flight time. And then the jobs that require the highest amounts of flight time tend to be, you know, maybe some of the corporate jobs or the medevac jobs, things like that.
Cool.
But good question.
Yes. And in fact, the last one I'm going to leave with is the one that it was somebody else that emailed us this one early. So it's kind of appropriate. It was the very first question we got before the webinar even began. And somebody just asked it now. I don't know if you think you can paraphrase what Ian said, or I've got his response right here that I can read. That idea of gyrocopters and airplanes and helicopters. Do you remember what he said, or do you want me to just read off what he mentioned?
Do you have the question in front of you, perhaps? Or I know
Yes.
it dealt with whether or not gyrocopters, if you have a good amount of gyrocopter time, if that makes a good pathway
Yes.
into helicopters. Is that
Exactly.
the
There's gyrocopter too.
question?
Exactly.
Sure. I will say that I personally have not flown a gyrocopter. I would love to someday. I think they're fascinating aircraft. Up until this point, I've not had the opportunity, so I can't speak from any personal experience. That being said, just what I know about the way that helicopters and gyrocopters operate. A gyrocopter is really a very interesting combination of helicopter and airplane.
Mm-hmm.
At first glance, they can seem more akin to helicopters just because one of the first things that you're going to see is the large spinning rotor on top. But that being said, they aren't like helicopters in that the rotor on top is not providing thrust for the gyrocopter. It's purely providing lift. What is actually providing thrust, similar to an airplane, is going to be a propeller. And it can be mounted in the front or the back. I know the vast majority are mounted in the rear. But for that reason, helicopter or gyrocopters are really interesting combinations of airplanes and helicopters. And I know that flying them, you're going to be utilizing some skills from both categories. But from what I have heard from different friends of mine that do fly gyrocopter, I've heard that they tend to be more akin to flying airplanes a lot of the time. And also that some of the most difficult things to learn in a helicopter, like for example, auto rotations or hovering,
Right.
those are regimes of flight that you're not going to learn. Either you're not going to learn in a gyrocopter or you're not going to learn in the same way, so that they wouldn't carry over very well. But what I know that you have Ian's response there, Chris, and he actually, unlike me, has experience flying gyrocopters. What were some other things that he said about that?
You covered the vast majority of it, but the big thing that he also said was, and he said the same thing, that it's more akin to an airplane than it is a helicopter, and they are a beautiful mix, and he loves them and highly recommends that you do them. But the one thing I also know that he mentioned too, which I think that the person who asked the question said too, was that it's very difficult to find gyrocopter instructors. And so just the availability of them is so limited that it's probably better just it's gonna be easier to find a helicopter school and helicopter instruction, especially.
It's one of those things where you're really pitching through the regulations and you see that, you know, some things only require previous experience in rotorcraft and then carry over between gyrocopters and helicopters. It's easy to see that as like, ooh, this is a cool hack that can really help me get there cheaper. But in reality, I don't know that it would be a great path, simply because there are a lot of skills that don't carry over that well. Now, that being said, if you're learning to fly a gyrocopter first simply because you want to be able to fly a gyrocopter too, Absolutely. I think that's a great way to go if your motive is just to fly different types of aircraft. But if you're doing it specifically with an eye, getting your helicopter rating more cheaply, I'm not sure that that would work all the time.
Fair enough. All right, Michael, we have come to the, in fact, we've even gone a little beyond the normal end of our time, but want to thank you so much for putting the time into preparing this for us and sharing your experience in helicopters. Please do remember as well, if you've got any questions, we do have our Pilot Information Center, which is a huge wealth. And I know that we've got Craig Brown there, who is a helicopter. Is he a CFI too? I don't remember. I know he's a helicopter pilot. I don't know if he's got a CFI in helicopters or
Don't
not.
know. He might be, but yeah, I'm not entirely certain.
He's a wealth of knowledge, though. I know that. So
That is for certain. Yeah.
yes. So again, Michael, thanks, Stephen, and we have actually one of our compatriots, Chris Horwat, in the background helping us with monitoring some of the questions. So I want to thank everybody for being with us today, and I want to thank obviously all of you for being our audience. We can't do this without you. So we will see you next month. Don't forget, You Spin Me Round will be our topic. That's July 18th, 2024, and barring that, I guess let's go ahead and call it. Thanks, everybody, and have a good day.
All right.
A lot, everyone.
See you all next time.